Cool.
Hi, welcome to our new show we're doing. This is a professional guide seminars we want to do every week on Mondays at 12:30. And the point of doing it live is to give viewers a chance to ask questions, comment, be involved. I mean, I think the idea of these seminars is they're two-way, but also should be interesting to watch after. So some of you may be watching live right now, and some of you may watch this, at like 2 a.m, 3 years from now. We have no idea. So this one is a good talk about leave no trace in the context of river guiding, given by my friend Dustin Abbott. And Dustin's somebody I've known since 2012. We've guided together a bunch, mostly multi-day trips. And he's been a commercial guide for 10 years. He has a master's degree in outdoor adventure and expedition leadership. He's an ACA and IRF raft instructor, as well as a NOLS instructor. And this is a topic I think he's specifically good at talking about because he's also a leave no trace master educator. So with that, I want to introduce Dustin and welcome to the show, Dustin.
Sweet. Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it. Glad to be here. Again, like Zach said, I'm going to kind of talk about this concept or this ethic of leave no trace. I kind of want to just introduce you to the principles of leave no trace, and then offer you the opportunity to kind of like think critically about leave no trace, and what I'll refer to from now on as LNT. We're going to talk about, there's 7 principles. We're going to talk a little bit about each one, specifically how they apply to a river environment, a backcountry, likely multi-day wilderness environment on the river. We're going to do this. I'm going to give you a brief history on LNT. I then want to define what an ethic is. This organization is the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics. And then we're going to review the principles. We'll discuss them, and then maybe offer some like alternative ideas about these 7 principles. So first off, LNT, Leave No Trace, was a program. It started in 1987 by the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the BLM. In the early 90s, NOLS was enlisted to develop a program to educate individuals on minimizing their impact in the wilderness. Yeah.
Let's not interrupt really quick. Your audio is coming through kind of weird. Turn your video off. At the bottom, there's the thing that should say stop cam. That'll probably make your audio come through better. There you go.
How's that?
Better.
What'd you miss? Miss anything? Can you still hear me? All right. In 1994, LNT, or Leave No Trace, incorporated as a 501c3, and they became known as the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics. Today, the center works with many state, national, and international agencies to educate tens of millions of people annually. So what is an ethic? By definition, Merriam-Webster, it is rules of behavior based on ideas about what is morally good and what is morally bad. It is also a belief that something is very important. And I think it's important to introduce LNT because it's important to, I feel it's important to protect and preserve our wild places. And as a commercial raft guide, modeling these behaviors and these ethics help to increase our guest experiences. So some things that I want you all to think about while we're going through these 7 principles. Some questions that I want to prompt you with. What does wild mean to you? What does wilderness mean to you? And what is essential for a wilderness experience? So now I just want to introduce you to the 7 principles of Leave No Trace. We have plan ahead and prepare, travel and camp on durable services, dispose of waste properly, leave what you find, minimize campfire impacts, and respect wildlife. Great. So those are the 7 basic principles. They're a little self-explanatory, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each one. Again, this isn't like a full leave no trace tutorial. This is more in regards to river travel. So we're going to move into plan ahead and prepare. Have seen me taught, I often use the kind of this alliteration: proper preparation prevents piss poor performance. So principle number 1, plan ahead and prepare, is just that. You need to have a good knowledge of the area. You need to understand most of the rivers that we do on multi-day commercial trips require us to have a permit, and our permit requires us to have specific things like equipment, groover. It requires us to dispose of our waste in a certain way, and so on and so forth. You should know what the weather's going to be and what sort of food you're going to be bringing. Typically, oftentimes your trip leader is kind of in charge of all this. Myself as a trip leader, all these things are kind of in the back of my head as I'm planning and preparing for my trip every week. But as a guide, even if you're not the trip leader, you should still know what the weather's going to be. Are you packing a tent? What kind of clothes are you going to bring? So on and so forth. Great. Moving on, I want to continue moving down to principle number 2, which is travel and camp on durable surfaces. Now, in a backcountry river environment, we're very constricted to a river corridor. And so to me, camping on durable surfaces really means camping on already impacted places. We don't want to continue to increase or impact the wilderness in new areas and new places. So oftentimes we want to stay where people have already camped so that we're not creating more of an impact in that region. On a lot of rivers, like the Middle Fork Salmon, you typically have assigned campgrounds. Out here on the Rogue, it's kind of first come, first serve. But I still feel it's important to be camping on those already impacted areas. Now, as you're leading guests on hikes, again, it's important to stay on trails, not create more erosion where there isn't already some, so that we're not impacting the native flora and fauna that exist in the area. Obviously, we want to leave our space better than we found it, and camp away from things like trails and creeks. Travel on trails, yes. And I think that there is a camp on durable surfaces. Please feel free to visit this website. This is lnt.org, and they go much more deep into this whole ethics and philosophy of leave no trace. Like I said, camp on established sites and on places that are already durable. We don't want to just camp out on a marsh or be impacting unimpacted areas already. Moving on, principle 3, dispose of waste properly. Again, this one is largely probably dictated by your permit. In a river corridor, typically we need to pack out all of our human waste. So you need to plan ahead and make sure that you have a groover, that you have enough space in that groover for the number of people to accommodate the number of people on your trip, enough tanks, enough wag bags, whatever it is. You need to have a way to dispose of all your trash. We bring trash boxes with us, line them with a trash bag, and all of our typical trash would go in there. Again, largely dictated by your permit, but know how to dispose of things like your dishwater. or your liquid human waste. Out here on the Rogue, all of our liquid waste tends to go into the river, and we strain that through a strainer so that we're not just throwing food particles into the river. Now on the Middle Fork salmon, it's a little different story. You're supposed to scatter any dishwater above high water mark. Desert rivers are more similar to the Rogue in that we're putting all of our liquid waste into the river as well. And in that environment, they just don't have, the desert environment doesn't have the same microbes and bacteria to break that sort of stuff down. You may be encouraged to use like a kitchen tarp within your kitchen to catch any food particles that may fall to the ground as you're preparing food. And again, like it's kind of this mantra of like, we pack it in, we need to pack it out. Everything that we bring in with us, we should be taking out with us as well. Human waste, cat holes, this is more for like backcountry hiking travel. Latrines don't typically dig. Toilet paper, we want to make sure that all the toilet paper is going into our groover so that we can dispose of it at the end of the trip. We want to make sure that we're not adding any sort of like hygiene products to our groovers because they clog up our disposal machines. Pack it in, pack it out, like I said, making sure that we're leaving the space better than when we found it. Wastewater, again, you know, we're emptying all of our wastewater into the river here on the Rogue, and it's very permit dependent. L&T suggests that we're not doing that, but in certain areas, that is what our permit requires. Leave what you find. This one kind of hits me a little bit personally. I have many friends out here on the Rogue that love, just absolutely love to go hunting for agates, and they just bring home buckets of them all the time. And you know, I can maybe understand like picking up one or two here and there, but ultimately, like, I mean, we've all gone out and like picked up a rock we found that we absolutely love and bring it home, and ultimately it just ends up on a shelf somewhere that only I can enjoy, and maybe I don't even have that memory of like finding it again. So I think it's really important that we leave what we find. This is historical artifacts, not natural artifacts, and this includes things like elk antlers. The watershed on Desolation Canyon has tons of elk that shed annually, and people go out there and go elk shed hunting, and they just go collect all the elk sheds that they can find and bring them back and sell them. But it eliminates the opportunity for others to enjoy. Desolation Canyon also has a very unique camp on it. I forget the name of the camp, but there is something there that it's called Turtle Fossil, and there's an imprint of the shell, the backside of a shell of a turtle in a rock. And in the 90s, well, prior to the 90s, there was an actual fossilized turtle shell there that you could pick up and enjoy and check out, and it was really cool. And in the 90s, somebody came and removed that turtle shell, and that kind of experience now has been really eliminated for many people to enjoy at that camp. Fortunately, that impression of the turtle shell still is there on that rock. I think this also goes to like live things. Like we want to maintain our riverways, and we want to make sure that we're not introducing species that aren't already there. All over the country, rivers and lakes are kind of getting flooded with random invasive species from all over the place, and are impacting the existing ecosystems quite tremendously. Minimizing site alterations. We don't really want to like dig holes to like flatten out areas for tents. Definitely don't want to damage any trees. This is a common sight that we see, is people carving their initials into trees. We want to avoid doing this. Again, leaving these natural and cultural artifacts where they are. Great. Principle 5. This is another one that minimizing campfire impacts. This is another one that I find important as well, especially on rivers. I want you to take a minute and think about a time that you've spent around a campfire and the feelings you had and the experiences you had. Campfires can provide an incredible experience and a great guest experience. We oftentimes sit around a campfire in the woods, talking, playing music, telling stories and jokes. And this is a really important. I think having campfires on a river is really important to an experience. But we want to make sure that we're minimizing those impacts of the campfire at each campsite. So the first thing is, what sort of wood are we using to build our fires? Typically in a river corridor, we're looking for old floating wood. I like to consider this rule of wrist, that we're not burning anything bigger than the size of our wrist. We're collecting driftwood, and anything that's already what I would consider dead, down, and detached. We don't want to be cutting down trees and pulling down limbs off of trees in order to create our fires. And we typically want to build our fires in a raised fire pit. LNT recommends at least 3 inches off the ground. And ideally, we're also using some sort of fire blanket underneath that in order to avoid scorching the sand or scorching the earth that's underneath our fire. And as again with disposing of waste properly, typically we want to pack out all of our fire ashes. We don't want to just throw them into the river. It seems really easy and logical. Oh, I'll just put my ashes into the river. But with the dynamics of rivers and their hydraulics, what tends to happen is those ashes and those coals float around in eddies and just really collect along our beaches. So we want to avoid doing that. Make sure that your fire is completely out. And typically those coals and that ash can go into, if you've planned ahead, they can go into their own dedicated ash can or ash box. And if they are completely out, we can then throw them into a trash box or a trash receptacle. Something that I've struggled with in the past, on the Rogue River where I work a lot, we share a lot of our camps with hikers, and hikers typically come through mostly during the spring. We get a number of folks during the winter and the fall, and they're not following these same procedures. So typically when they build a fire, they go and gather some rocks and they build your classic fire ring, and they have their fire in the camp. And as I've in the past, as I've gone and come across these fire rings, I'm like, this isn't, maybe best LNT principles, and they should have discarded this. And so I'll go and break down those old used campfire rings. But as I've kind of thought about it, if I go and take down one campfire ring that's been set up by a hiker, the next hiker may come in and build another one somewhere else, continuing to increase the impact of fires in that region or in that camp. So I'd like to think about this as, an adapting ethic. Do we take down that fire ring, or do I leave that fire ring for other hikers in the future to use, so they're not continuing to impact those camps with fires? Great. And again, I like to think of these ethics as adaptable. These aren't hard and fast rules. And this example that I'd like to use just around fires, if if you don't have, let's say you are running a rapid and you flipped your boat, and for whatever reason you've now lost your fire pan. People are now cold and wet, and you need to dry them off and warm them up. Are you not going to build a fire because you don't have your fire pan anymore? Or are you going to take an approach to do it sustainably, do it in the best way possible to minimize the impacts, so that you can warm and dry people? So these are things to consider when, going through all of these ethics and all of these ideas or rules, if you will. And here are some, types of constructions for minimizing campfire impacts: fire pans, cleanup, all that good stuff. And of course, safety, safety first, minimizing risk around fires. So just be aware. I think dictated by our permit as well on the road, we're required to have a shovel and a fire pan and a bucket nearby full of water, so that if anything does happen, we can control that fire. All right, principle 6, respecting wildlife. We do our best here. A lot of times you may just end up surprising an animal, but what we want to avoid doing is feeding wildlife. And that comes with planning ahead and preparing. How are you going to keep your food safe at night from rodents and bears and other critters that might get into it? Really important. Out here on the rogue, the BLM offers us a lot of electrical fence that we can put all of our food in if we need to. We typically use a lot of lock boxes and keep all of our food in those in camp overnight. And typically somebody's sleeping nearby, so that if there is an animal that comes into our camp at night or our kitchen at night, that we can scare them off. We want to typically observe animals from a distance. We can spook animals, and from what I understand, can spook them to the point of having some sort of heart attack or cardiac arrest. So we want to avoid doing that. And then if you are fishing or enjoying some recreational fishing, we should be following those regulations as well. Catch and release, I think it's catch and release only on the Middle Fork salmon, and then out here on the rogue, catching steelhead or trout that have had their fins clipped. Great. And then we also want to avoid sensitive areas. I know on the Middle Fork salmon, when the fish starts spawning, when the salmon starts spawning, we want to avoid impacting any of the redds or the areas where the salmon are laying eggs. Great. And aside from just enjoying animals at a distance, it's kind of the safer way to be, especially if you see things like bears and whatnot. Keep your distance, stay safe. And being considerate of other visitors. This one's another one that kind of gets me. This is the final principle, the final ethic, if you will. Considerate of other visitors. In a river corridor, this is we have a number of people. We have hikers, we have people fishing, and as boaters, being extra considerate of the fishermen, the fisherwomen that are out there, the fisher people that are using the corridor. We want to be considerate of them. Typically, try to give them a wide berth, as well as other boaters. Kayakers like to surf in holes, and as rafters, or kayakers will surf in holes and waves, but as rafters, we're not typically as maneuverable. So if you're a kayaker, maybe trying to get out of the way for those rafters as they're coming through. And if you come up on a group that is that's maybe moving at a bit slower pace than you, be friendly, make contact, say hello, introduce yourself, and then ask if it's all right to pass. And if you want to pass them, and if you do decide to pass them, try and pass them really quickly, and move through their group relatively quick. And if you are that slower group that's kind of has a leisurely pace down the river, be willing to let that group pass. Make contact, be friendly, let them go by. And then potentially, even get out of their way. There's no need to make other boaters maneuver through you and zigzag between your entire pod or your entire group. Yeah, and I think that's everything as far as the 7 principles. Obviously, I've left a lot of things out. I highly recommend coming and checking out this lnt.org and get a little bit more nitty gritty with some of their ethics and some of their ideas. And taking this to heart and being able to practice this on the river, on your trips, on your specific trips. I think the best thing that we can do for our guests is model the behavior that we value and that we want to see in others, so that they continue to follow these examples elsewhere in their life. There are some, maybe what I would consider, limitations to leave no trace. If you really think about it, anytime we go outside, anytime we take a walk in the woods, we are having some sort of impact. Leaving no trace at all seems to be rather unachievable to me. But what I want to do is be conscious and aware of the impact that I am having, and try and reduce that impact as much as possible. So that's why we introduce kind of like these 7 principles. And again, like I said earlier, these 7 principles, they're ethics, and they may need to be adapted for certain situations. There have been arguments made that these principles tend to disconnect you from the natural world. So again, like, just being conscious and aware of the impact that you are having on the natural world and the wilderness environment. And something to consider again is like our impacts. So maybe in the future you're not saying, hey, that's not LNT practice, or that's not leave no trace practice, but think about it more as a minimum impact practice or a minimum impact adventure, and how we can minimize those impacts. Or what I read earlier today, somebody was calling it conscious impact living, and being aware of those impacts that we have on the environment. And I just kind of want to wrap this up with a quote from Aldo Leopold for you to think about. And Leopold says, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity of the biotic community." So if we think about the impacts that we have and how it's impacting or preserving that quality of biotic community and wild places, I think we're doing good things, and I think we're modeling good behavior for our guests. And yeah, that's all I got, Zach. I'm not sure if anybody has any comments, questions.
I have a bunch of questions and notes, things I want to just run by you. Do you want to try turning your video on again and see if we can make that work? It'd be easier to ask you questions with your video on. And I think there's a lot of gray area on some of these things worth talking about. I just want to get your thoughts on it and just throw some things out. One is if anybody, if you're following along, please ask questions. I'm just going to take this over if nobody else has questions. If you get to a campsite and there's trash there, do you have a moral obligation to remove that trash? You know, is like you didn't leave it? Is it a leave no trace principle to remove it, or is it your choice?
I mean, according to what LNT practices would suggest, would be that you're leaving that site better than the way you found it. So again, this is a moral and an ethic, and I think that you get to choose what practices you are following. Our last Grand Canyon trip last February, almost a year ago now, we camped next to a group of kayakers, and they had discovered a pile of charcoal, plastic bags, and bottles of lighter fluid. and they asked us to pack it out and throw it in our trash. And we did just that. We were able to actually use some of the coal briquettes for some of our cooking, and managed to like haul out a bunch of trash that was just, it was interesting because it was almost like somebody had hidden it and stashed it away. But it had been there for a while. All the plastic bags that it was in were deteriorating and rotting all over the place. But we were able to pack out quite a bit of trash that was left out at one of our camps, next to one of our camps. Yeah.
Cool. Here's a question from Kevin. Any thoughts on drone use on multi-day?
Right. So I think this gets into like respecting others. We're living in an age of like a lot of technology. I have a lot of friends that like to bring, you know, speakers and music with them on the river. You know, they don't typically turn it down as they pass by other folks. Again, I think it's well within your, you know, your ethic or your moral to use drones or to play music while you're on the river. But I urge you to be conscious of how that may be impacting others. And if that's something that would impact you, how would you feel about it if somebody was flying a drone over you and whatnot? So again, like, I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer to this. I think it's this idea of an ethic, what you believe is morally good or what is morally bad. And how those actions are impacting others.
On the thought of drones too, most wild and scenic rivers, all wilderness rivers, drones aren't allowed, right? And a lot of wild and scenic rivers, they're not in the management plan. In fact, the entire Rogue, you're technically not supposed to use a drone, although you see people do it. And I've heard enough stories about how they impact other users to where I'm personally against them now. I like drones. I have one. I fly it. But on a multi-day trip, I've heard enough stories of weird things where I'm personally against it.
It's not even really the impact of well, yes, it impacts other people, but it also, I think it can impact the environment. I've watched plenty of like, I kind of dig on these guys on YouTube who go like scuba diving in rivers and stuff. In popular places, kind of like looking for treasure or like lost things. And they've popped up with a number of drones. People crash their drones into the river, and now it's bitter. I mean, that's trash in the river.
Yeah. So you're technically leaving a trace by crashing your drone in the water. Which reminds me of a story from the other day where we left. I have to remember the story. Something happened. We left something behind that we kind of had to leave behind. And I'm like, that was leaving. We just left trash. I think it was like, I don't remember what it was. And you also mentioned speakers. This was a question I had in my notes. You know, if you're playing music on a speaker and passing it to the group, would that be violating being considerate of others? Like, do you feel like there's an obligation to turn your speakers down when you're around it's just considerate different group?
I think that, you know, like, that music may be impacting their wilderness experience. You know, like I said earlier, like, what does it mean to be in the wilderness? And for some, it may be like to get away from technology. And as you cruise by with, you know, your death metal or your gangster rap in the middle of a wilderness area, that may really be impacting somebody's experience on the river. So I think it's just a good idea. Again, like, I don't know if it's right or wrong or good or bad, but I think it's a good idea.
Yeah. It's a pet peeve of mine. I really don't like it when other groups are playing music. I am passing us. I feel like the least they can do is turn it down. I go so far to say is like, if you're passing me wearing headphones, that's disrespectful. I mean, take your headphones off for a minute, say hello, wave, engage in conversation, but to just have headphones on and just push by, I feel like, I don't know. I'm not a fan of that. I'm not going to go on my pet peeves though. We have Liz 217 _ has a question. After you've given her a safety talk that includes info about Leave No Trace, can you give examples or suggestions on approaching a guest or the boater that are not following LNT?
Good question. Again, I want to avoid saying, "Hey, that's not LNT." When we get into like the nitty gritty of what like these ethics are trying to say, like they put down some pretty objective rules, like camping. Like if you're backpacking and you're camping, they suggest being 200 feet away from water, and that would include things like streams or lakes. Well, on the river, oftentimes we're camping right on the river. And most of the time that's because that's where the impacted area is. If we were to be moving further out into the woods, we'd be impacting and encroaching and increasing the area of impact. So I might like gently ask somebody about how they feel about what it is that they're doing. Again, I don't want to point fingers and be like, "Hey, that's not LNT," because that's not really what this is about. This is about picking a set of morals and ethics, and with the understanding that we're trying to preserve and conserve the places that we love, these wild places that we want to experience. And again, like, what does wilderness mean to you? Like, what is essential for a wilderness experience? And that may be that, you're not seeing signs of other people. So how are we reducing those impacts so that our guests can have that experience, that they can have the true wilderness experience? And so just, like asking people how they perceive their actions are impacting others. Obviously, if somebody's just throwing a cigarette butt on the ground or doing something ridiculous like that, I might, approach them, or I might just pick it up after them, like, and throw it in the trash. Just trying to do my best. And again, like, I think that modeling this behavior is the best thing that we can do in order to like keep this moving forward and protect these places.
I have another question. I just thought of,
yeah.
Where does this apply to the front country? Like, if I'm downtown Portland, am I still following Leave No Trace ethics? Or is this, you've mentioned wilderness a few times, is this wilderness specific stuff, or is this just like everywhere?
That's a great question, and it's tough. Obviously LNT was developed to preserve these places in the wilderness, in the backcountry. But I don't think that these ethics necessarily translate holistically. Just because we're packing out our human waste in the backcountry doesn't and we dump it into the scat machine or into the septic tank or whatever, doesn't mean that disappears all of a sudden, right? Like, everything that we're doing has an impact. And so I think that the title, this Leave No Trace, is really kind of one of the limitations of these ethics, because it doesn't really describe what it is ultimately that we're trying to do, right? We're still creating waste with plastic bags. We still have to drive to the put-in. We're still, all sorts of things. We're creating pollution with our cars, and everything that we do has an impact. And so getting back to this idea of instead of leave no trace, this idea that we're impacting these wildernesses, these wilderness areas much, that we're trying to minimize the impacts that we have, and that we're conscious about the impacts that we have, because we are a part of the nature for the most part. And so we need to have an idea of how we need to live holistically with that. So these ethics, I don't think, really translate very well into a front country world. Obviously, we shouldn't litter, but if you're walking down downtown Portland, you're not necessarily worried about staying on trail or camping near a water source or whatever. But you can be more conscious of things like recycling and reducing consumption and reusing the things that you have.
Do you think they apply to put it in a takeout?
Certainly.
Okay.
But again, we just need to be conscious of those impacts. Like there's many boat ramps that we use that aren't paved, and even the paving of a boat ramp to get to put in, like that's an impact.
Yeah.
Right? Like that ultimately goes against L&T practice. That's why I think that we need to consider how to minimize those impacts, but we still want to enjoy these places, right? If we wanted to have zero impact on these places, you just wouldn't go there.
Yeah,
But that's not realistic.
True. Yep. Next thing I want to ask, I actually have a list of questions, Destin. I'm sorry to keep you on the line, but I'm dying to have these conversations. When you talk about dishwater and you put dishwater in the river, it has soap. And so we're adding soap to the river. And I can see how in some rivers, that's the best way to handle the soap. In other rivers, it isn't. And I was thinking about food particles. Is it absolutely not okay to put food particles in the river? I mean, should everybody be straining their water, or is it just like it's okay to have a little bit of great cheese here and there?
I mean, hard telling, not knowing. I don't have the science to back this. Personally, I think it's best to remove as much as you can. We do our best to strain out all of our food particles out of our dishwater every time we empty it into the river, every time we broadcast it above high water mark. However we're disposing of it, we certainly do our best. Because then that would, if we're putting food particles into the river or into the high water mark, that's violating, respecting wildlife. Right, because now we're littering and potentially feeding animals and things that they're not used to eating. So all we can do is our best, right? And as far as soap and chemicals, we use bleach in our water too, and the most common cliched statement is the solution to pollution is dilution. And so by putting our dishwater into these rivers, that's kind of the stance that we're taking. As far as long-term total impacts of that practice, I really don't know. But according to the people who regulate the recreation in these areas, that these are the best practices, that these have the minimum impact, and that's really what we're looking for.
And I know your answer is going to say, well, I don't know, it depends, but I'm going to try this anyway. You have your bank bucket full of just like beans and cheese. It's just like the first bucket, all the trash, and you do sump it, you do pass it through the strainer, and you get a lot of it, and you have to walk it to the trash to empty it. But there's your bucket has a little bit left, like just a tiny bit, and you're tempted to be like, you know what, I'm not going to wait for the strainer to come back. Let's just toss that in the water. I mean, do you feel like we have a responsibility to get every single little piece, or maybe just like this one time, let a little bit of cheese go in the river?
I feel like you know the answer to that in your heart, Zach.
I do know the answer. I do. I know how I feel sometimes, and I'm like, oh man, I have to wait for somebody to walk all the way to the trash and come back, and I literally want to lay down and go to sleep. Do I want to get that little tiny bit of food out of the bottom?
I totally know exactly where you're coming from.
I want you to tell me, yes, absolutely, you need to get every piece of food out of that bucket.
And that's ultimately what I'm going to say, is that as commercial guides, as professionals, we are the face of protecting these wilderness and these special places, these wilderness areas, these river corridors. And again, we need to be modeling the behavior that we would like to see in other people. And I know that feeling where you're just like, God, I just want to be done with dishes. But that,
I know one piece of cheese and one bean doesn't matter. I'm like, I mean, it's just like so little. You kind of just let it go.
But we're looking to minimize the impacts wherever we can. Maybe we need to come up with
And
a better system for straining then.
yeah, maybe. I think, or just do it. I think that your point of like modeling, we're modeling as guides, we're modeling good behavior. So if we take a shortcut, then it will like model more and more shortcutting, and eventually people will be throwing food in the river, and those invasive species who love dishwater cheese will come take over the river corridor.
Exactly.
How do you feel about using soap to bathe in the river?
Again, I think this is that like solution. The solution to pollution is dilution. We can do our best to use biodegradable soaps and follow the protocols set in line by governing agencies that adhere to the permits that we've acquired. And that's the best we can do. And again, like this is, we're looking to minimize impact. Oh, also maybe you don't need to bathe, like depending on how long your trip is. Like, are you on a 3-week Grand Canyon trip, or are you on a 3 or 4 day Rogue River trip? Can you bathe when you get home? I don't know.
Yeah.
These are all questions, like great questions, and they're questions that you need to be asking yourself as they arise, and these situations come up.
Don't worry, Dustin. I have more of these. I have more of these. I have 3 more. 3 more.
Shoot.
You mentioned, okay, you also talk about removing agates. People removing agates. I can see it's like a really cool thing and you want to take them. What about just a river rock? What if you're like, you know what? I have a garden where I collect a rock from every river. How do you feel about somebody just taking like a rock?
I mean, what is
and there's
the
hundreds of rocks. There's thousands
of
of rocks. You're in a rock bar. There's rocks as far as the eye can see.
Right. What is the intrinsic value of that rock? Like it's so subjective. I personally, like, for whatever reason, I
like Chris. Thanks for leaving.
I have a hard time with this one. Like, I see people wanting to do it all the time, and by the end of the trip, there's literally like 20 pounds of rocks in somebody's bag. I'm like, I've seen it happen. It's in their day bag. People carry it around in their PFDs, which is ironic to me as well. And so, I personally, like, it's something that I try and, as far as a guest experience is concerned, if there's a kid that's really excited about rocks, at the end of like on the last day or something, I might be like, hey, pick out your favorite, and try and get him to get that child, him or her, to leave the rest.
I think Chris's comment about the one bean and cheese across each overnight, each trip throughout the year adds up, kind of answers the rock question in a way too. If you extrapolate everybody taking one rock on every overnight, on every trip, I think it adds up in that case.
Certainly does.
What about a stick? Sorry to dive deep here, but like, is a stick different than a rock?
In the fact that its existence here is a little bit more finite in the tangibility of it. I don't know.
Like, would it be okay to maybe remove a stick and not where a rock is maybe not okay?
I suppose. Again, it's really up to the user, and how you value that space, and the intrinsic value of the experience that you're having with that stick. If you're having if that stick is just like really making an experience for you at that particular moment, that stick might make that a similar experience for somebody else. And so now, are you impacting other users or other visitors to the area?
Yeah, if it was like some really cool piece of burl wood that was like perfectly shaped like a certain way, it's special to you because it's cool, but you're taking that experience away from the next person coming down, experiencing that really cool stick.
Yeah.
Where maybe if it's just like a boring piece of wood, it's okay, which is not very cool. The boring. I mean, I feel bad for boring pieces of wood because they can be just taken away. I have 2 more questions. The last one is a little more in depth. This one is easier. In terms of minimizing campfire impacts, What if you're
Yes.
camping in, a lot of river corridors have been burned. What if you're camping in a river corridor that's burnt to the crisp? Right. There's already like burnt trees everywhere. And there's like, like how much does minimize in campfire? Do I really need to pack up my coals then?
I would say yes. Again, modeling this behavior. And if we're talking about like a commercial setting, like we really want to be modeling this behavior. We don't want to be increasing to the impacts of what's already there. Maybe even occurred naturally. But the fires that we're having aren't necessarily naturally occurring fires. And, again, going back to increasing impact, like, great, that fire happened. Did it happen yesterday? Did it happen 10 years ago? And that soil and that sandbar may be recovering from that previous fire. And so by not following these principles or ethics, we may be continuing to cause harm regardless of whether or not it's impacted already or not.
Cool. It's interesting for me. Like if I was on the middle fork of the Salmon where there's regular traffic, I would be very conscientious and always pack out, of course, even though there's like a burn right there from last year. But on the Chetco, which has been burned to a crisp, there's maybe 4 trips a year. Maybe I know I'm not adding that. It's not an additive effect, kind of like the bean and the piece of cheese, adding up overnight. Would I then maybe not pack out my? I don't know. These are just we pack it out, but I think about this a lot. Like this forest burns, and I'm packing out like this much coal, from tonight's fire. It seems a little bit kind of overkill.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And again, that's why I think that these ethics and these principles are adaptable, because not every situation is the same. We have a lot of unique experiences as well. Like you said, on the Chetco River, that doesn't see as much traffic. Maybe you make sure that fire is like, you brought a fire pan, but maybe you don't have the means to pack it out. You can grind it up, make sure that it's burnt down as small as it can be, and potentially consider scattering it. I don't know. That statement may not be up to LNT best practices. But again, I think it's considering how to minimize the impact that we're having on that specific area.
Okay, my last question has to do with social media. I've heard the LNT is considering adding an eighth topic, which is like minimize social media use or don't tag certain places. And I know it's a problem, but people going to a place and tagging it, and that's bringing a lot more people there and attention to fewer spots. How do you feel about social media use on, in terms of how it can affect these backcountry areas?
That's a hard one.
That's why I saved it to last. I didn't come up with easy questions. I mean, I guess some of them are easy, but I want to come. I mean, these are things I think about.
Sure. And I've thought about this too, but it's hard. I have friends that post their stuff to social media, and then they geotag it with some like ridiculous spot, like Mall of America or something. Like they're out backcountry skiing and they tag it with like they're in somewhere random.
Or location tag it somewhere different.
Yeah. So like they're not actually sharing where they're playing.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of, on some level it's kind of funny. On other levels, I'm like, where were you really? So I think that's one way of, minimizing that. And so, I see all these great places on social media, and I'm like, oh man, I'd really be interested in visiting that as well. And but I think what it really comes down to is how you plan ahead and prepare for that. And are you able to minimize your impact in order to access that space? So maybe it's really about how do we reach more people in this type of education, in this type of ethic and principle. How do we educate more people about being conscious of their impact and minimizing it and having this holistic, conscious impact lifestyle? Yeah, it's a hard one. And again, I think that's up to the user. That's up to the person who's doing it. If you value that space, maybe you're not sharing it on social media. I love visiting hot springs. I go to hot springs, and anymore it's almost impossible to visit a hot spring without just like tons of other people. And this stuff is blowing up all over the place. So if you value your wilderness experience, if that's what it means to you to have an experience where nobody else is around, then maybe you consider not tagging those locations and, reporting that you were, somewhere completely different. I don't know.
Cool. Yeah, some I think about sometimes. I've never thought about tagging a different place. That's something I'm gonna have to do more of. So
I think it's a
one thing.
Fun idea.
Yeah, I like the Mall of America or whatever. That's pretty funny. Well, I just put in the comment section below. There's I thought about this. There's a Leave No Trace online program. It's an online education. You get a certificate at the end. If you guys want a little more LNT specific education, and I think it takes a couple hours to do. It's well done though, and so it's worth their time. Please think about it. Again, it's just a way to get better educated. This is something that seems like every river guide could and should take. Like I think you can do it from home.
It's valuable information for sure.
Yeah. Well, Dustin, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. If people want to follow you somehow, do you have like a Twitter or Instagram or Facebook?
Yeah, a little bit of Instagram. I don't do a ton of social media, but I think it's Wilder _adventurer
cool.
On Instagram. Yeah, you can check it out there.
I'll put a link in the notes for this YouTube video. And Dustin, thanks. Any final thoughts before we shut this down?
Thanks again, Zach. Again, just think critically about these things, and just try and be self-aware of your experiences and the experiences of others in wild places, because they are special places that are becoming more and more impacted with greater use. And after this past year, people are really starting to see the value again in being outside with COVID and quarantine and stuff. And so these places are going to be seeing more use. So we just need to be conscious of how we're using them and how we're impacting them, and what we can do to preserve them and protect them.
Yeah, and that's why I asked about the picking up of the trash question earlier. I've seen more trash this year than ever. This is a year where I feel like we should almost be going out with trash bags, expecting to pick up other people's trash.
Certainly. And we've done, I did that on our last Grand Canyon trip. There was a couple times where we just had the whole group stop. There was like 15 of us. And right before we pushed off from shore at camp, we did like a collective beach sweep and just, walked around wherever and picked up every little bit of trash and anything else that we could find that wasn't naturally supposed to be there. So it's pretty easy to do.
Well, thank you, Dustin. Again, this is a show we're going to try to do every week where we're going to invite an expert on some topic. I'm sure Dustin's an expert on many topics, so I'm sure we'll have Dustin back at some point here pretty soon. But next week, Mark Hirsch is planning to join us, talk about safety talks, giving a good safety talk. And again, every Monday at 12:30, we're hoping to have some sort of live show with education for professional river guides. So